Hello and welcome to episode 82 of a Plain Accounts podcast series where every week we get together and discuss the gospel lection for this upcoming Sunday. As always, I'm joined with my co-host, Danny Quanstrom. Care to say hi, Danny?
Hello.
Hello. And our special guest today is Nathan Willowby, who has graciously provided this Gospels commentary for this coming week. If you have not yet read it, log on there, read it, post a thought or reflection in the comment section. And the rest of our commentaries are just stellar this week, so be sure to log on and read that. Nathan, would you introduce yourself to our audience? It's great to have you today.
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me. So my name is Nathan Willowby. I teach theology and ethics at Anderson University in both the undergrad and graduate programs. So we have a seminary and undergrad. Teach mostly undergrad courses, but some seminary ethics as well. My preaching voice was honed during my doctoral work. I was the pastor of Crossroads Church of God in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for 7 years before taking up this post. So my preaching now is different, but I did have 7 years of that grind of what is God going to need to say today. So yeah, that's kind of my preaching context.
So 7 years, which meant you reached the number of completion, perfection, and you...
Yeah, I was like, well, it's time to do something else. No.
Yeah, no. So what, just out of curiosity, what is your educational background?
So I came here to Anderson University undergrad. So Anderson University is a Church of God Anderson school. And then I did 1 year at our seminary, and then I transferred and finished up an MDiv at Duke Divinity School. And then after that, I spent a year working around there in some Methodist and Presbyterian churches, cobbling together work before starting doctoral work at Marquette, where I worked on holiness and political theology, dissertation with D. Stephen Long, and then defended, and was fortunate to be able to have this position here open up and come back home in a sense.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's great. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast today, and we're looking forward to this conversation. We're looking at Matthew 22, 34 through 46, which, as Nathan mentioned in his commentary, is a very popular passage of Scripture. It's the Greatest Commandment, and there's often a tendency to kind of gloss over some of the finer points of this because we are so excited and want to talk about the command to love. So today we're hoping that you will come away with from the podcast with a little bit of a deeper understanding of maybe the finer points and how we can invite our congregations to understand this passage deeper. So let me read Matthew 22, 34 through 46. As always, I just gravitate towards the NIV version, and I'll be reading from that version today. Matthew 22, 34 through 46. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, "What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he?" "The son of David," they replied. He said to them, "How is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one could say a word in reply. And from that day, no one dared to ask him any more questions. The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. So one of the things that you started off in your commentary, Nathan, is how oftentimes we can look at these two sections that the lectionary gives us as almost split in two. Like we'll either read the Greatest Commandment or we'll read who is the son of the Messiah. And honestly, I don't think I've ever heard a sermon preach on these two passages connected, as if they correlate with one another. And even now, as I read this, I'm thinking, well, how are we as pastors to read this passage and then preach a coherent sermon on it? So can you maybe start the conversation off on how this may be connected, some of the points that we might be missing?
Sure. I think, one of the reasons that we follow a lectionary is someone else or lots of someone else are exerting some wisdom and saying, hey, your tendencies might need to be checked here.
Right.
This historical community has said, hey, there might be a connection here. Now, sometimes we can go too far and we can try to preach all 5 texts in one sermon and we get lost. But there are other ways in which sometimes that moment of preparation to say, okay, why did Matthew put these together? Why did the lectionary put these together? Why are we dealing with this? And that can't happen Saturday night, but it can happen on, Monday morning when you're thinking, hey, what is going on here? Yeah. And how can I do this in such a way that takes seriously the framing that I've been given? Mm-hmm. And so, for me, even writing the commentary, I had to wrestle for a while. Like, okay, what's going on here? Why are we doing this? And just so often, I think we get so caught into, all right, this is how I want to do this. And then we neglect the other half of the text. And so in this particular instance, I think that once again, we have Jesus presenting, okay, here's your answer, but also here's your posture. Here's fine. I'll answer your question. Can we be done? Can we move on? Basically saying you're asking the wrong questions. I do know the answer, but you're asking the wrong questions. And I think the funny thing for us as preachers is we all are faced with that same sort of situation as pastors, right? People come to us and they ask us a question and we are outside of it enough to say, maybe you're not asking the right question. And so this is one of those cases where I think we get to preach and pull the layers back a little bit and say, look at this, this text, but look what else is happening here. Because a lot of our folks know this text, right?
Right. And that's really good. One of the things that you mentioned as well is that we are still in the debate between Jesus in the temple with the Pharisees. Last week we talked about the Pharisees and the Herodians trying to trap him in that trap over poll taxes to Caesar. So we're still in that frame of mind with this sort of trapping debate. And so Jesus then moves on and almost just closes down the conversation. No one dared to ask him anything after this. Right. So this is like the closing argument, right? So how do we start off then in having our people perhaps ask the right questions about these two passages together?
I'm curious. So you guys said that you looked at this and all, and you've thought about it. So I mean, my commentary's out there. What's your first impression? So I almost want to like react to what your first thought was.
Sure, that's good. Danny, go for it.
Thanks. Well, one of the things that I find interesting about this pericope, or pericopes, perhaps about these pericopes, maybe there's these two that seemingly, it's kind of like, why are they together? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I find really interesting is that the Pharisees come to test Jesus, and he's like, okay, great. I'll address what you're discussing. And then in verse 41, it's like the tables are turned, and Jesus becomes the antagonizer to the teachers. Like he puts them to task. And it's saying, okay, you have a question for me. Well, tit for tat. I've got a question for you too. And they're stumped. The teachers of the law are stumped on the Psalms, which is kind of like ridiculous that they wouldn't know what to say in that situation. Mm-hmm. So, but one of the things I find really interesting is the attempt to trap Jesus or to test Jesus. And their question is, I don't know, it's to us might not sound like it's that much of a test. which commandment in the law is the greatest? I mean, that might sound like a legitimate question, but I think, as you indicated in your commentary, Nathan, there were like 613 laws, and according to the Pharisaic tradition, there wasn't one that was greater than any other. They were all on par. And if you were to say one was above the other, you were in some way in error. And so this is a test, like, which is the greatest? And the answer is, well, there is no greatest law. That's the answer. That's what Jesus should have said. So I'm kind of curious, how does Jesus shut him down? Like, why are the Pharisees shut down from this? And why did they not ask any questions later on? Because Jesus doesn't give the right answer. And so that's what's striking to me, is that Jesus gives the wrong answer and they are stumped. According to their understanding, it's the wrong thing to say. But with that, I also think there's a qualification that needs to be made in verse 39, that a second is like it. That's not saying that this is a secondary commandment. This is saying these are connected. These are the same. That you cannot love God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind without loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is putting these on par. So the fundamental law becomes love. But I'm just struck by Jesus gives the wrong answer, and that becomes the right thing to say.
So before Nathan responds to that, maybe I'll just give my response that's connected with that. I saw it as maybe pushing the Pharisees, as we've already discussed, to ask the right questions. Like, well, what is the purpose of the law? The purpose of the law is not to have these obligatory restrictions or rules over us for no reason. The spirit of the law is to give us these guidelines to free us to loving relationship with one another. And so he's almost pushing the boundary, like, well, yeah, all of the law and the prophets are on this notion that you will live this out in relationship to God and neighbor, which are the two tablets, right? God laws, neighbor laws. These are fused together and lived out in this community, this ethic of life. And if the laws aren't doing that, then there is essentially, as Danny, you mentioned, there is no law. None are greater and none are less, because then there is no law if you're not actually living this out. So that seemed to be at least my thought of what Jesus is doing here, is using that time so often as he does to push the imagination of those who are listening.
And so I think one of the real geniuses of Jesus that we see in this passage and in so many of his encounters is that same genius we're invited to imitate in preaching, which is, I think it's a Craddock saying that says, tell the truth, but tell it slant. That people have so many barriers built up to hearing what they need to hear. And that so we have, what are we going to do then as preachers when you start with a text like this and you're like, all right, they've heard this before, Greatest Commandment, they're tempted to immediately check out. And so what are we going to do? And Jesus gives us some examples, right? Reframe the question. Yep. Don't start with what they expect to hear, right? They probably expected him to do something to try to get out of the question, and yet because they're like, hey, I'm going to ask him a question he can't answer, and so he's going to look silly or whatever, and I'm really going to diminish him. But instead, what we get is Jesus is like, okay, I'll play this game. I'll answer but not answer. Right. And I think in preaching, that's the opening act that we almost have to do with a well-worn text. So I've got a friend who teaches similar types of classes, but in a totally different context. And it's so fascinating to hear the different ways that we try to teach the same material, because he's dealing with people who don't know Bible stories at all. And I'm dealing with people who need to rehear them differently. Right. And so if we're in churches, a lot of times we're dealing with people who need to rehear them differently. And so I love just the language that my preaching professor, Richard Lisher, used was these focal instances. And we have to like draw some pictures and shock people into seeing like, oh, this is a valid question that you don't actually know the answer to. Right. And so I would start this. I might even, there's a video if you do YouTube, G-D cast on YouTube. There's like a Leviticus song that's got it's a cartoon, but it's Leviticus 19. And you get to see demonstrated in cartoon that all of these laws that we think are just a list of rules, how much of life is woven into them, and how it's not just personal, it's not just social, it's both. It's weaving all this stuff together. And it's I don't know. I just think that the real task is, yes, love God, love neighbor. We've heard that 100 times at church. How can we like confront people in such a way that they'll actually sit there and think and not space?
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. I mean, because at least from my perspective, the tradition that I was raised in, the law doesn't save us, and the prophets are obscure and weird. So we're not gonna think of loving God and neighbor as including or contingent on those in balance in our lives as well. So that was just a comment, Danny. Well, what were you going to say?
well, I was going to say that I don't know. I think confessionally, I think we're prone to live like the Pharisees in terms of like the questions that we ask. Like, I don't know. That question seems like the thing that we should ask. Which is the greatest? Like, I mean, you think of the guy who asked the question, what do I need to do to inherit the kingdom? What do I need to do to make it? Like, what is the minimum thing I need to do to get by? And Jesus says, oh, that's not right. Sell everything you have, give it to the poor. Okay. So I think we're prone to ask questions like, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And maybe it's a legitimate question, like, well, how do I need to live my life practically?
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost like Jesus saying that's not the right question to be asking. Like, yeah, love God, love neighbor. Okay, now let's ask the right question. So my question is, what makes Jesus's question the right question? What makes the question, what do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? How is that the right question?
Yeah.
And quite honestly, isn't Jesus trapping the Pharisees here? Like, why doesn't he just say, who is the Messiah? Whose son is he is a targeted question, right? Like, he's baiting them.
Uh-huh.
Whose son is he? And the response is obviously the son of David. And so then Jesus has another question. But like, what makes the question, what do you think of the Messiah, the right question to ask, instead of which commandment in the law is the greatest? Why is that right? Why is that better than the other one?
Well, it reorients immediately the notion that these are things to be memorized and things to be practiced, right? So so many of the various things that we deal with theologically, we have to come to these stories in order for people to remember them. You know, like any old fancy heresy. We don't teach the specifics. I mean, honestly, I think I know, but the whole homoousios. I know the eye matters, but it's easy on a given day to figure out which eye, do I want the eye or do I not want the eye? The sheep and the goat story, it's easy to forget. Do I want to be a sheep or do I want to be a goat? I know it matters what I am. And that's the thing. It's like when we put it on this question of who's the Messiah, it immediately it kind of pulls it out of memorization into trajectory and practice. I think that is not a Matthean argument, perhaps, but in terms of preaching, one of the things that Jesus has done is he's taken it out of just a cognitive exercise, just a debate floor.
Right.
He said, all right, well, who are we going to look at if we're going to answer this question?
Right.
And he's basically saying, look at me.
Right.
And then we're going to see that repeated. Paul's going to make a similar move. Look at me. Look at what this looks like, and then try to do it. And yes, you can call me on various things, and I should reflect that rational understanding or that memory that the church has and that the law provides, that the prophets have recorded for us.
Right.
But when push comes to shove, let's start looking at people.
And I think that identity is what's so essential, right? Like, the identity of Jesus matters. The identity of the Messiah matters for who I am, for my own identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps Jesus' question, whose son is he? If you think throughout Matthew, Jesus has asked the question before, who do you say that I am? And how does Peter respond? You are the son of God, right? You're the Messiah. And so the Pharisees here are saying, hey, you're the Messiah is the son of David.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding a Semitic understanding of sonship, to be a son was not just like to have a father and birth a child. Son was this identity. I remember in Hebrew we would talk about that they didn't have adverbs. So you wouldn't say a humanly one or a godly one.
Mm-hmm.
You're the son of man or the son of God in order to indicate some type of identity about this person. And so to say if it's a son of David would to say it's a Davidly one. It's one like David, which indicates the type of kingdom they're hoping for, right? And then they're looking for the Davidic kingdom rather than the kingdom of God. But perhaps Jesus is saying, no, the answer is the Son of God. The Messiah is a godly one. You're looking for the wrong type of Messiah. And I am trying to help you understand the right type of Messiah to be looking for, which is not seeking to set up a temporary, geographically based kingdom in which Israel is like the greatest nation among nations. Jesus isn't saying make Israel great again. Jesus is saying let's bring the kingdom to this earth, and you should be looking for a godly one, not a Davidly one.
Yeah, and I even think so. I've been wrestling with Willie Jennings's text lately, also Christian Imagination of the Theological Origin of Race.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's something going on here too in pairing these together with this flip in this chapter of it's not just about like which rules or commands or material can be mastered best, but you have to look at who the Messiah is. That it cannot be divorced from that. So one of Jennings's critiques is that there's this move into Gentile space that Gentiles forget that it's an inherited or a borrowed faith, that we suddenly end up with colonialism when we think we can just take this wherever we want and appropriate it without recognition of its connection to Jesus.
Right.
And so there is this move, I think, in this chapter and even in this lectionary text that if anyone's familiar with Jennings's work, or even just to announce these ideas of identity that we're always dependent upon being grafted into God's election of Israel through Jesus, would be the most simple way to kind of articulate what Jennings is trying to do there is to say, no, you can't just master this material separate from Jesus.
Right.
Like it's not yours to then go and appropriate separate from Jesus. This is inherently tied up with the one who shows us what it means, that explains it, that unpacks it, that demonstrates it. And that if we come to an understanding of the law that doesn't fit with Jesus, there is a sense in which we need to call into question how we've been understood and appropriated that, and that we've probably missed the boat. And I think I'm going way beyond the text in this, but there's a sense in which I think that can be preached when we talk about, look, everyone knows. You can watch the person in your life who knows the 10 Commandments the best, and their life doesn't look like it, and we immediately know something's amiss. And so I think there's an invitation into understanding and then living that can get brought together with these two pericopes.
Absolutely. So in our final in our closing for this conversation, I'd love to talk a little bit more about how we might preach this to invite people in. My notions are, making maybe perhaps presenting the juxtaposition of, there's that whole movement of keeping the 10 Commandments in the courthouse, or they put it on their lawns, on those signs and the bumper stickers and things like that. And even in this whole flag debate, I've heard so many veterans talk about, yes, we respect the flag, that's why I won't eat my ribs off of a paper plate that has the flag all over it, or I'm not going to wear it all over my body in my t-shirts and things like that. So there's this idea of respect in our culture that if we put the cross everywhere, or if we put the 10 Commandments everywhere, or the flag everywhere, that we're somehow showing our honor or homage to that. And I feel like this pericope flies in the face of that. That says we have to have our practice put together. We can't just show this outward idea about it. So like what sort of things like can we talk about maybe that are culturally relevant to bring these people into this text?
I think the flag is pertinent and dangerous. I think if it's done well, that can be one of your most effective angles in here. But it also runs a risk of you losing everyone before you get started, is my first, as you talk about that. I wonder, I wouldn't have jumped to the flag, but you mentioned that, and I could both see the fruitful possibilities, and yet you would have to really understand your context and know how to talk about it so that it doesn't just become something lost.
Right.
I would have probably start with some sort of story or question that would lead people to imagine the person that they think demonstrates the best of something. So maybe it's a context of think about the best teacher you had. Was it big? And then like tell a little story about your best. I don't know. I always thought Mrs. Knaus in third grade, she knew what she was doing. To talk about that, and then invites the congregation to think about whoever was good at something that most of us have experienced, and then say, why were they so good at that? Did they have mastery? Did they have practice? Did they have skill? And then I think I would then segue into that, there's just one option, into a way of, look at the way that Jesus talks about these things that are most important to live with God well. Love God, love neighbor. And then like, who is that person in your life? Who could we look at and see that? I don't know. That'd be one angle in.
That's good. Because in that proliferation of symbols and meaning, we have so many different definitions of love. And so you putting that flesh to that shows what God's definition of love is in this idea of Messiah, law, and prophets. That's really good.
The only thing I would add is maybe calling out what laws we have created, because I think we definitely have in our denominational structures, in our local church structures. I don't know. I think maybe a challenging but fun thing to do would be look at membership expectations, and talk about that. What does it mean to be a member of this church, and what do you have to do, or who do you have to be in order to be a member? And maybe call into question if it's above loving God and loving neighbor, and if it's above your relationship to the Messiah, are we creating unnecessary laws that hinder kingdom possibilities? And so we could, and maybe some of those, you could even call into like things like Sunday dress. What do you wear to church? Are there laws, maybe written or unwritten rules that we have created? What does platform attire look like in your church? What are the ushers supposed to wear? Because these are things pastors hear about. If you're on the platform, you shouldn't be wearing shorts. If you're an usher, you shouldn't be wearing shorts. That's one I heard 3 weeks ago. There was an usher wearing shorts in church, pastor. That really bothered me. Okay, I'm sorry. But like, are those the most essential things, or are those deviating from the harder things of relationship to Messiah?
Yeah.
I think we maybe like to trick ourselves into thinking we have this proximity to God when we follow these rules that we have stipulated for ourselves, rather than this vulnerable relationship with the Messiah, who is the Son of God and the Son of Man.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also another approach that might look at even just asking people their impressions of the Great Commandment. Since it is a text that people know, I think one way to get them to not tune out is start by acknowledging that and saying, all right, like this is a really common text that you're probably tired of me saying, love God, love neighbor. And then invite a little moment of imagination in your seat or pew or, whatever. How have you heard this text before? And to actually, I think sometimes if there's a danger with a really well-worn text, maybe I start out with, all right, I know you know this. What's the fullest expression you've seen of loving God and love neighbor? And then allow that to then lead you into some of the context that you want to to add, but to get people tied in with, hey, this is one of the big texts of Christianity. You've probably heard it. I bet you have some opinions on it. Let's think about how that works.
Yeah,
that's another kind of angle in.
that's really good.
Absolutely.
Well, we're out of time for today. I really appreciate you being with us, Nathan, and your work on the commentary and your conversation with us. It was so helpful. For our listeners today, keep a good eye on our social media. That's where we do the most of our conversation and advertising. The link to our podcast today will be published on our Facebook, and there will be a link on our website to be able to access that. Be sure to join the conversation. We love seeing those comments. We love seeing your reflections on this as well, to our commentaries and other things. So go and preach boldly, and may the love of God and love of neighbor take on a fresh, new ways of living in your communities as a result of your preaching. Nathan, thank you again for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right.